Hey guys, Mike Burke with Inside Real Estate Photography, and in this video I'm going to show you what you need to know to make professional real estate videos, including the gear you'll need, along with the camera settings and techniques I use to get great shots. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the demand for real estate video has been soaring lately. I probably did close to 10 times the amount of videos last year as I did the previous year, and this year that number's only going up. I firmly believe that video is going to be a huge part of the real estate photography market in the coming years, and we need to be ready to meet that demand head on. So I decided to make this video because I've seen a lot of posts from real estate photographers and forums asking for advice because their client has asked them to make a video for them and they've never really done one before. At this point in my career, I've done a lot of real estate videos and I've really ironed out my method, so I thought I'd share my experience with you. With the skills outlined in this video and some practice, you'll be ready to go out and make professional real estate videos for your clients in no time. So before I get into explaining my process, let's take a quick look at a real estate video I shot recently to give what we're going to be talking about some context. So the gear I use to make real estate videos is really straightforward. I'm using the same camera and lens setup that I use to do my real estate photography, along with a motorized gimbal. In my case, that's a Sony a7 III camera with a 16-35 G master lens, and the gimbal I'm using is the DJI Ronin S. So in other words, in addition to whatever camera you have, you're going to need a wide angle lens, which you probably already have if you're shooting real estate, and a decent gimbal. If you are shooting on a full frame camera, I definitely recommend the 16-35 focal range, because if you're trying to shoot anything wider than 16, especially with video when your camera's in motion, you're going to get a lot of distortion. It's also great to be able to zoom into 35 for those tighter detail shots. If you are shooting on a crop sensor camera, something like the 10-18mm range would be a good option for you. So as far as gimbals go, it really does depend on your setup. I really do love and recommend the Ronin S, but one of the main reasons I'm using it is because of the weight of my camera and lens. The 16-35 G master lens is a considerably heavy lens, and the Ronin S is one of the few single-arm gimbals out there that can support my lens and camera combo sufficiently. DJI makes a smaller and cheaper version of this gimbal called the Ronin SC if you have a lighter setup, and also Zhiyun Tech is another company out there that makes great gimbals that I've used. Just make sure you check on the weight limit of whatever gimbal you're interested in before purchasing it to make sure your camera and lens setup is well within those limits. So another little piece of gear that I recommend is this Manfrotto quick release plate. The reason I use this is because it fixes the position of my camera on the gimbal so I can pre-balance my gimbal at home, so when I show up to the shoot, all I have to do is slap my camera on the gimbal, fire it up, and I'm ready to go. I don't want to be messing around with the gimbal on site trying to get it balanced in front of my client. For one, I want to take up the least amount of my client's time as possible, and two, it makes you look somewhat unprofessional in my opinion. You want to show up to a shoot prepared, ready to go, and looking like you know what you're doing. By the way, I'm not going to get into how to balance the gimbal in this video because it's slightly different for every setup. Just do a YouTube search for your specific gimbal and how to balance it, and tons of videos will pop up. Alright, so that about covers the gear. If you're interested in any of the gear I'm recommending, I'll link to it down in the description below. Alright guys, let's talk about camera settings. The first thing we're going to want to do is make sure we turn our camera into video mode. Once our camera is in video mode, we can manually dial in our settings for shooting real estate videos. So the first thing we're going to want to set is our resolution. I shoot all my real estate videos at full HD 1920 by 1080. I do this for two reasons. The main reason being I want to shoot at a higher frame rate so I can slow my clips down later in post-production. My camera only supports 4K shooting up to 30 frames per second, so I don't have the option anyway to shoot 4K video at a higher frame rate. If your camera supports 4K shooting at 60 frames per second or something like that, and you want to go that route, that's up to you. The other reason is because I think 4K is actually overkill for real estate videos anyway, and the files can be big and cumbersome to work with. So the next thing we're going to set is our frame rate. Like I said, I like to shoot at a higher frame rate, so I'm shooting at either 60 or 120 frames per second. 120 being slower than 60, obviously. This allows me to convert my clips into slow motion clips later in post-production and make them look very smooth. Most cameras these days support 60 frames per second at 1920 by 1080. Some may not support 120 frames per second. 60 frames per second will do you just fine. I like both and I switch back and forth. Next up is picture profile. If you're unfamiliar, a picture profile just basically applies a certain look to your footage. For example, a lot of people like to shoot in what's called a log or flat profile because it allows for more dynamic range, but the drawback is it requires a lot more time and effort in post-production with color grading. I used to shoot in log for real estate videos, but I don't anymore because I found I wasn't getting paid enough for the amount of time I was putting in. I use a Sony camera, so I'm shooting in what's called PP1 or Picture Profile 1, which is basically just a standard profile. It requires only a little correction in post, and I'm very happy with the results. So now that we have those things taken care of, we're going to set our shutter speed. So if you're unfamiliar, there's a principle in video shooting called the 180-degree shutter rule, which suggests that for the most natural looking motion, you should set your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is, or as close to it as possible. For instance, if we're shooting at 60 frames per second, we're going to want to set it to be 1/125th of a second, or if you're shooting at 120 frames per second, you're going to want to set it to be 1/250th of a second. We're not really shooting any fast motion in real estate videos, so we can bend this rule a little bit and get away with it. For instance, if I'm shooting indoors at 120 frames per second, a lot of times I'll set my shutter speed to be 1/125th of a second instead of 1/250th to allow a little bit more light in and the footage looks just fine. Once we have our shutter speed set, we're going to want to leave it be because we're going to be using ISO and aperture only to control our exposure. Okay, so next up is white balance. We're going to want to set our white balance to manual Kelvin because we're going to want to manually set our white balance for every single shot that we do. If you try to use auto white balance, you're going to experience color temperature shifts in the middle of your shot, like when you're moving from one room to another with different lighting, and it looks very unprofessional. I also set one of my custom buttons to access white balance so I can set it quickly. Alright, now let's talk about focus. Just like white balance, we're going to want to set this to manual because when you're shooting a house, there's a lot of objects close to the camera and far away, and if you're trying to use autofocus, you're going to experience focus hunting or things going in and out of focus because your camera doesn't know what to focus on. Also, a helpful tip here is to use focus peaking if your camera has it. Focus peaking just outlines things that are in focus in a certain color to help you determine what's in focus and what's not. Alright guys, so that about sums up all the camera settings I use to shoot real estate videos. Of course we're going to have to adjust our exposure from shot to shot, but we'll get to that in a minute. One more piece of advice regarding the settings is that I strongly recommend you save these settings to one of the custom slots on your camera. That way you can just turn the dial to that slot when you want to shoot video and you'll be ready to roll. Okay, so now that our camera settings are taken care of and our gimbal is balanced and ready to go, let's talk about the shooting process. As I said earlier, I pre-balance my gimbal at home and throw it in my bag, and because I have this quick release plate on it, I'm able to just slap my camera on it when I get to a shoot and it's ready to roll. If anything got a little out of whack during transit, I'm able to make any micro adjustments, but I'm not spending 20 minutes on site rebalancing the whole gimbal. Speaking of the gimbal, let's talk about a few things regarding that first. If you ever used a gimbal before, you know it isn't magic. You can't slap a camera on it and start walking around and expect to get perfect footage. You need to master what's called the ninja walk, which is basically keeping your knees bent and moving your feet forward in such a way to minimize any up and down movements. We are shooting these clips at a higher frame rate to convert them into slow motion later in post, so that will make your footage look a lot smoother, but you still need to be conscious of how you're walking. Also, I'm using the gimbal in full follow mode, so it will follow my movements whichever way I'm moving it. So as a general rule of thumb, I find that shorter shots come out the best. The longer the shot you try to attempt, the greater your chances are for there to be imperfections in it. Also, more complex movements run a higher risk for flaws as well. I'm not saying not to try those shots, but I find that keeping your shots fairly simple and straightforward usually has the best outcome. After all, we want our finished video to be exciting and to the point, so these clips will only be living on screen for a few seconds in the end anyway. You don't need to be walking around with the gimbal trying to capture the entire house in one shot. So the first thing I do before I shoot a room is stand near the entrance and get my settings straight. First being the exposure. Because of the limited amount of light when shooting indoors, your aperture is probably wide open or close to it, so 95% of the time, I'm solely relying on ISO to adjust my exposure. So once I have my exposure where I want it, I then press the custom button I have programmed to set my white balance. I do this by eye by adjusting the white balance until the colors on my screen match as close as possible to the colors I'm seeing in the room with my naked eye. So as far as focal length goes, again, I'm using a 16 to 35mm lens on a full frame camera, and most of my shots are going to be shot at 16mm, except for a few shots here and there, but we'll get into that shortly. Finally, we need to set our focus point. I usually focus on the back wall of the room or something across the room at a distance. Alright, now that we have all that set, we're ready to take our shot. It's key to have a variety of different shots in your arsenal so that your viewer doesn't get bored watching your video. For instance, if all your shots are forward walking shots into a room, one after the other, that would get redundant and boring for your viewer fairly quickly. I have a few favorite types of shots that I incorporate into my videos, and I will outline those now. First is the forward walking shot, as I just mentioned. This basic shot is definitely the most frequent shot that I use. Second is the reverse walking shot. Third is a sweep or a horizontal moving shot. Next are pan and tilt shots. I'm executing these shots by pressing the joystick on the gimbal up, down, left, or right. These shots take a little practice and finesse to be gentle enough on the joystick to get consistently smooth movements. Finally, we have the dolly or slider mimic shots that I use to capture details. These are the shots that I was talking about where I typically am zoomed all the way in on my lens to 35mm on to achieve as much bokeh and parallax effect as possible. My feet are staying put and I'm simply moving the gimbal parallel to my subject while keeping it as level and as even as possible. So those are the basic shots that I perform for each shoot. Of course, I'll throw some different ones in here and there when the situation presents itself. I just go room by room, executing a nice mix of these shots so I know I'll have what I need to make an awesome video once I get to the editing process. I always aim to capture each room in a wide shot, then if there are any features or details present, I'll focus in on those with a few additional shots. Definitely don't be afraid to get creative and try different shots. As I said earlier, it's key to have a diversity of shots to keep your viewers intrigued and interested. Well guys, that concludes my method for shooting professional real estate videos. I really hope this video gave you a clear idea on how this process is done, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below and I'll be happy to answer them. Also, in a future video, I'm going to illustrate how I edit these videos, so look out for that as well. Also, if you're interested in any of the gear I talked about in this video for making real estate videos, I'll link to it down in the description. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.